Hi, and I'm back for the second lesson, where we will continue our discussion of how to deepen our positional understanding and positional principles we must know like the back of our hand. As a little review, the main guideline idea of a chess game is an activity. It's determined by two factors: the quantity of your forces, known as material, and the position of your pieces, known as activity. We analyzed the material factor in the previous lesson, and now we will discuss and turn our sights to the second factor, activity. This is the art of placing your pieces on the most active positions. This is what a positional play is all about. Your forces should control the maximum number of squares on the board. That may seem easier said than done, but with the concrete principles and guidelines we will take a look at, you should be able to keep your pieces as active as possible in practical games quite easily. Where should you place the pieces in order to control more squares? The specific rules are quite simple. You should move your pieces forward and keep them closer to center. Almost every piece controls more squares in a center than on the edge. However, we shouldn't forget about our opponent, who will strive to do the same with his position. With that in mind, we should strive to increase the activity of our pieces and decrease an opponent's activity. Here, the white's king controls 8 squares, while his black counterpart controls only 5 squares. This is a simple illustration of how powerful pieces on the center are compared to those that are on the edge of the board. Keep in mind the principle of the center. Keep your pieces on the center. Here we're talking about a horizontal direction. Whether to place your pieces in a center or on a side. Talking about a vertical direction, we should move the pieces forward. In this position, the white's knight is active and controls 8 squares. The black's king controls 5 squares. Using a computer's method of evaluation, we may say that white has an advantage plus 3. White controls 3 more squares than black. If we move the knight forward to e6, then it will still control 8 squares, but it will also restrict the black's activity. Here the king controls only 3 squares. Thus the white's advantage became plus 5. That's why it's always a good idea to move your pieces forward. This is an ideal situation. You increase your activity and decrease your opponent's activity. This brings another principle in mind, which is the principle of maximum activity. You must move your pieces as forward as possible. Knowing this principle alone can help you find the right move in many different positions. The white's bishop is under an attack. Where it should go? The a6 square is the most obvious destination. This is the most forward available square. How much time do you need to realize it? 1 second. This is how grandmasters make right moves even in blitz games. From the a6 square, the bishop controls the c8, not allowing black to move the rook there. This is another illustration of how forward movement with your pieces can increase your activity and restrict opponent's activity at the same time. Going back to our scheme, we have discussed 2 practical principles related to activity. These are principle of maximum activity and principle of a center. These principles will greatly help you to decide where to place a certain piece. You should keep your pieces closer to center and move them as forward as it's possible. Since you have many pieces on the board, you also need to know which piece to move now. As you will see, another straightforward and easy to understand principle will help us pinpoint which piece needs attention. In this position, the white c3 knight controls 8 squares, and the a1 knight controls 2 squares. All in all, white keeps 10 squares under his control. If white moves this knight to d5, this will increase the white's activity, because this is the move forward, but nevertheless white still controls 10 squares. Okay, now let's go back. If white moves the a1 knight instead, it will control 6 squares, and because of this move white will end up controlling 14 squares here. Comparing it to the 10 squares from the previous example, we can conclude that move of the a1 knight is more advantageous for white and it brings white more activity. This brings us to the principle of the least active piece. While choosing which piece to move now, you should select the least active one. This also explains why during the opening stages of the game we should develop knights before bishops. The f1 bishop is already quite active. It controls this diagonal. The g1 knight is less active, and therefore we should move the knight now. Everything becomes clear when you have a good understanding of a chess game. Of course, the principle of the least active piece works in any other position as well. By the way, I don't stick on these principles too much because I have already done it in the course The Grandmaster's Secrets. I hope that you studied it already. Otherwise, I recommend that you study it after this course. These two courses supplement each other very well and will give you excellent practice as well. Time for another review. Now we know 3 practical principles based on a factor of activity. When you need to decide what piece to move, you use a principle of the least active piece. Then you apply the principles of a center and of a maximum activity in order to decide where to place this piece. That's it. Yes, it's that simple. We have finished with the principles of activity related to your forces. However, as I have mentioned, every chess player shouldn't forget about his opponent. But worry not, I've got you covered here too. Certainly the same principles work for your opponent's pieces as well. Thus your goal is to follow these principles by yourself and to hamper your opponent in doing the same. Therefore, for the opponent's pieces you will use the same principles in an opposite direction. For instance, following the principle of maximum activity, you should move your pieces forward and push opponent's pieces back. As we already know, the greatest power has a piece on an opponent's territory. It's very active by itself, and it also restricts opponent's possibilities. That's why you should move your pieces forward. And that's why it's essentially important to push opponent's pieces back from your half of the board. Pushing off an advanced opponent's piece is known as the principle of neutralization of an opponent's most active piece. It states, if you see an opponent's piece on your half of the board, you should neutralize it somehow. It's Black's turn now, and he has lots of things to do. However, this decision isn't that hard for us because we know the base principles of a chess game. We can see the white's knight on the black's half of the board. It means that black should neutralize this piece somehow. It also means that this is the black's primary task. Before anything else, one should think of the base principles I have outlined. Black played knight d7. After the following moves, bishop takes, queen takes, king h2, black took the white's active knight, and now white can take by the queen, but after rook d5, black will double rooks on the d-file and will get an advantage. In the game, white recaptured by the pawn. F takes e5. Black still replies rook d5, getting an excellent position. Black controls the only open file, while white has a weak pawn on the e5. Let's have another little review. For your pieces, you use a principle of maximum activity. It means that you should move your pieces as forward as it's possible, preferably on an opponent's half of the board. For opponent's pieces, you use an opposite principle of neutralization of his most active pieces. It means that you need to remove opponent's pieces from your half of the board. Moving on, how do you use principle of the least active piece for your opponent's pieces? As usual, we need to find an opposite rule. You should activate your pieces, especially less active ones, but at the same time you need to restrict opponent's pieces. It's called a principle of limitation. And it's pretty obvious actually. It simply means that you should restrict an activity of opponent's pieces. I'd like to emphasize that we're talking about the same thing. A principle of the least active piece and a principle of limitation is the same thing actually. The difference is whether you use it for your pieces or against opponent's pieces. Thus, these two principles are equal. Their effectiveness are equal. For example, in this position white has two options. First, white can continue his development and play something like knight c3 or castling. Secondly, white can play d6, hampering the black's development. After that, it will be harder for black to develop his c8 bishop. Sometimes people ask, "Hey, but doesn't the move d6 break the principle of development?" I hope that now you know the answer. You may increase your activity or decrease opponent's activity. These are equal ideas. Thus, in this position, a move d6 is good and it doesn't break any rules. White may develop his pieces or hamper black's development, and both ways are good. We analyzed how to apply the principles of the least active piece and maximum activity against opponent's forces. This is how we arrived at the principles of neutralization opponent's pieces on your half of the board and the principle of limitation. Next question. How to use a principle of a center against your opponent? Well, I think there is no need to create a separate rule about it, because it's pretty obvious. The principle of the center means that you should bring your pieces into a center. While doing this, your opponent will struggle and have a hard time fighting for the center. You don't need a special rule about it. Summing things up, we have created 3 rules about activity for your pieces. Additionally, these rules apply to your opponent's pieces and got us 2 more rules. These bring us 5 practical principles of activity that you should follow in your games. Keeping these principles in mind will help you place your forces on the best squares and to take control over the largest territory you can. Again, these 3 principles, maximum activity, center, least active piece, are used for increasing your activity, while the rest, neutralization of opponent's piece on your territory and limitation, are used for decreasing opponent's activity. By making a move based on these principles, you may either improve your position or worsen opponent's position. These are equal things. However, more importantly, you can find the most effective move that will allow you to perform these crucial tasks in one swoop. We have seen such situation while discussing the principle of maximum activity. When you move your pieces forward on an opponent's territory, you increase your activity and limit opponent's activity simultaneously. Such moves are the most effective. There is one another principle which allows you to make such great moves. It's a principle of an attack. In this position, black played knight d3. This increases an activity of the knight, because it's a move forward, and also it forces white to fall back. The f2 pawn is attacked, and the only way to protect it is to play knight d1. Thus the black's attacking move knight d3 helped him to increase his activity and to decrease white's activity. This is the power of attack, and that's why attacking moves like these are very effective. Continuing the game, black played queen e5, attacking the a1 rook. Attacking moves help you to realize your plan while an opponent only has to defend. He has no free time for performing his ideas. After rook b1, black played bishop c5. Now black is threatening rook h8, capturing the queen, and white has no defense. The principle of attack is quite simple. It states, if you can attack, do it. I don't explain it too much here, because I've already done it in the course The Grandmaster's Secrets. Moreover, in the course How to Be Title Players you can find a special lesson about this topic. I placed the principle of attack at the top because it's the most powerful principle. Attacking moves increase your activity and decrease opponent's activity. This is an ideal situation. That's why, first of all, you should follow this principle. Okay, now we have finished everything. You know all the principles of a chess game. Let's make a final conclusion. We'll go quickly over the whole system so that you will understand and digest it better. The main guiding idea of a chess game is activity. It implies the number of squares under your control. Your activity is determined by two factors: the quantity of your pieces and their positions. We decided to call these factors material and activity. You may use these factors to evaluate any position quickly. Based on these two factors, we concluded several practical principles to follow in a real game. Everything is quite simple as far as material or quantity goes. There is only one principle here, which states if you can take something, do it. Along with that, there are several practical principles related to the activity. These are your main guidelines for a practical game. First of all, you should try to attack. While making attacking moves, you increase your activity and decrease opponent's activity. That's why it's the best that you can do. Ask yourself a question: how can I move my pieces forward on an opponent's territory and take or attack something? If there is a way, you should use it. If you can't attack now, then you should either increase your activity or decrease opponent's activity. There are three principles for improving your position. If you need to decide which piece should make a move now, use the principle of the least active piece. After that, you need to detect where to place this piece. The principles of maximum activity and of a center will help you to make this choice. In most cases, you simply should move a piece as forward as possible. Except improving your position, you may also worsen opponent's position. This is an equal choice. There are two principles for decreasing opponent's activity. the principle of neutralization opponent's pieces on your territory, and principle of limitation. The main thing you should do here is to push back opponent's pieces if they came to your half of the board. That's it. This is the whole theory of a chess game. I've taught it in the last 2 minutes, so it's not that hard actually. Please accept my congratulations. Now you have a deep understanding of a chess game. You know how to play chess, and you know why the rules are so. We concluded all the rules based on the guideline idea of a chess game, an idea of activity. There is a strict logic in our system. That's why it will be simpler for you to apply it practically. You got a real understanding of a chess game on a grandmaster's level. Even lots of modern titled players don't understand chess so well. Let me congratulate you with this fact again. In the next lessons we will analyze different strategical topics. Having a good understanding of a chess game, you will digest all next topics easily. Right now, please perform a little task. Open the ebook with the text version of these video lessons. Read these first 2 lessons slowly and thoughtfully. It will help you to overlook a complete system of chess strategy. It's very important to digest this information. It should become a part of your chess nature. After that, please go to the next video lesson and I'll talk to you there.